Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest AFSA book talk. And today we are very, very grateful to be able to present what I think will be a fantastic program. We are very grateful and honored to have Professor Mitchell Zuckoff of Boston University, the Sumner Redstone Professor in Narrative Studies, with us. He's the author of multiple books, including books about other incidents that reflect the courage and sacrifice of the U.S. Foreign Service, including one on Benghazi. His latest book is The Secret Gate, a true story of courage and sacrifice during the collapse of Afghanistan. And we're very, very glad that he could join us today for this book talk. He has also written a number of other books, including Frozen in Time, an epic story of survival and a modern quest for heroes of World War II, and Lost in Shangri-La, a true story of survival, adventure, and the most incredible rescue mission of World War II. Now that I'm reading his bio, I think I'm going to get some of these books. But thank you, Professor Zuckoff, for joining us. And we are very, very glad to have Ambassador Mike McKinley, a dear friend, AFSA member, and four-time U.S. ambassador, including in Peru, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Brazil, with us, who will be conducting conversation with Professor Zuckoff. Mike has one of the most distinguished careers in our Foreign Service and has continued to remain engaged on all sorts of issues, including this very important question of what happened in Kabul and what happened for the 20 years that our colleagues, along with our military and intelligence colleagues, were involved on the ground and sacrificed on the ground in Afghanistan, and then how things ended in those days in August. So we're very grateful to both Professor Zuckoff and to Ambassador McKinley for joining us today. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Ambassador McKinley.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And thank you, Professor Zuckoff and Mitch, if I may. And thank you especially to our audience. It's Foreign Service Week, and it's one of those moments when we reflect on all the dimensions of our service to our country and our support for each other, designated by the U.S. Congress on a bipartisan basis. And certainly a good week to have this discussion. We're also coinciding with the end of the first season of The Diplomat. I was at Embassy London for 4 years, and I can say I certainly enjoyed what was real and especially what was not. And but on a more serious note, let me begin by noting that few books or narratives give a real flavor for what the Foreign Service does, especially when we're overseas, and more especially when we're working in extreme circumstances. And reading The Secret Gate, which, as Eric said, is about the evacuation from Kabul airport in August of 2021. Mitch, I can say your book certainly did give that flavor with a vengeance. And what we'll be speaking about today is so emblematic of what, diplomats have gone through over the years, over the decades, in dealing with difficult situations, wartime environments, evacuations, whether it's from Lebanon or from Liberia or from Afghanistan, choices that are made in how you help people, how you interpret the rules and regulations going forward. And we're so fortunate to have a book like yours, which sort of gives a wider audience the perspective on what gets done. And we're seeing it again over the last few days with our ambassador Godfrey in Sudan. And it's not in the headlines, but it's Foreign Service officers on the ground connecting to citizens, working in Port Sudan, working at receiving areas, setting up landing zones, setting up convoys, and often, taking very personal risks themselves to do so. But it does take a universe to respond in these situations. Our military, our intelligence agencies, State Department, our local employees, and then there's what individuals choose to do. And that's where your book brings to life the challenges of Foreign Service officers responding in crisis. It's often not a question of bureaucracy, but of a human urgent response to the crisis underway. I would note the Foreign Service Journal last year produced an edition with the individual stories of 22 people who worked on the evacuation. But you're not new to this, as if Eric indicated, and you're write on a lot of eclectic subjects. Another time, I'd like to talk about Robert Altman, one of my favorite film directors.
Wonderful.
But Lost in Shangri-La is about U.S. servicemen who survive an air crash in New Guinea in 1945 and what they have to do to survive and be rescued. 13 Hours focuses on what happened and what individuals chose to do in a very desperate situation. You have the story of 9/11, where and the fall and rise, and you focus on individual stories to highlight greater truths, what we're all capable of, how individuals react when they're away from the headlines and just reacting to challenges which seem insurmountable at the moment. So my first question to you would be, what is it that over time has drawn you to these kinds of stories, to focus on individuals rather than the politics of the moment, but on what it is we as humans are capable of reacting to as we go forward?
Well, first, thank you, Mike, Ambassador Mike, and Eric, and to all those who are on this call. I'm grateful to be here and honored to be here. To answer your question, before I answer your question, I hope you won't mind a small disclaimer. So I'm friendly with Mark Bowden, who you may know wrote Black Hawk Down, and Mark was speaking to a military audience once. I think it may have been at West Point, and a young officer stood up and asked a detailed question about tactics and weapon systems and better methods that may have been more appropriate in the moment during that horrible episode. And at the end, Mark took a breath and said, "How the hell should I know? I was never in the military." And so that's my way of lowering expectations here, because I'm fully aware that everyone on this call knows more about the State Department, knows more about diplomacy, knows more about the operation of embassies and consular affairs than I do. And that is both the starting point, if you don't mind, for this talk, and also for the way I approach this book and my previous book. So to answer your question, Mike, it's my belief so my father was a high school history teacher in New York City. And the way he taught me history was often, or generally, focused on the individuals and to build out the larger story from the experiences of a few people to whom I could attach my interest, my focus, my awareness of what they must have gone through, and to put myself in their shoes and to wonder, as I think we all do when we have these moments, what would I have done had I been pushed beyond my known limits in this moment of distress, and certainly in the prior books you mentioned, in Lost in Shangri-La and Frozen in Time. These are World War II episodes, but I can draw a direct line from them to what happened in Benghazi or 9/11, or certainly the Secret Gate. What Sam did, what Omira did when they were pushed to their and beyond their limits, allows us to understand in a way that, as a narrative writer, I believe a policy book would not hit you in the gut and make you remember it, because you can't attach to it quite so much.
I think that's a really excellent point. And there really, as I mentioned in my opening, there really are so few books that take that approach and still keep it factual going forward. And obviously, you write on different things, but you choose what you're drawn to. And I'm sure, there are many offers that come to you or stories that interest you, but you write books about certain experiences. In the case of The Secret Gate, what was it that made you decide to write this story? Did you know Sam Aronson from before, or Humaira Qaderi? the author he assists, or was it some other connection that drew you to it? Did you follow the evacuation closely at the time? Perhaps you could fill us in on
Sure.
the genesis of this.
Sure. I think like most people, I was following it. Any person who sort of cares about humanity was I think tuned in August of 2021 to what was happening on the ground in Kabul, and fearful that the Taliban's sudden return meant death or disaster for tens of thousands of people. I really appreciated something that Jim DeHart told me, and Jim was, there on the ground in Kabul, and he talked about how the you know the outpouring of people who wanted to get out, and the outpouring of people who were trying to help people get out, was the product of 20 years of relationships between Americans and Afghans who are there. And so I was compelled drawn to the story, but I had no connection. I had never met any of these people. Um, and but I knew there would be a great, I'm not saying mine is it, but I knew there would be a great book or books that came out of this. It was too important an event, and it was too emotional not to have some way, and I didn't have it. But then I got a call in the not long after, and it's a bit of serendipity. The woman who connected Sam and Omira was actually Omira's literary agent. So networks sprung up around many people who were on the ground, who were desperate to get out or needed to get out, whether they realized it or not. And one of these networks sprung up around this woman, Omira Kadiri, who is a remarkable author, activist, women's rights advocate, celebrity in Afghanistan. And so at the center of that network was her literary agent, was Marley Rusoff. And so she was reaching out to everyone she can imagine. And through a former ambassador, Sam Hines, who was her college boyfriend, an email reached Sam Aronson, this young Foreign Service officer who had volunteered for service in Kabul. And it just so happened that a friend of mine is a friend of Marley Rusoff's, and they knew that there was a story here. And so my friend told Marley, well, I know the guy who wrote the 13 hours. Would you like to talk to him? And as soon as I got that call, my only thought, and you're correct, Mike, I do get a certain number of calls in a given year trying to pitch me on stories, trying to pitch me on book ideas. And I say no to most because, number one, they rarely sort of rise to my interest. And two, they're really as billed in the elevator pitch. And as soon as I heard this from Marley, and as soon as I connected to Sam, and as soon as I connected to Omira, I knew without question, like, when can I start? I was thinking about another project, and so almost immediately, actually immediately, I said, this has to be my next book.
Well, that is the way things happen,
Hmm.
sometimes by serendipity. I would only note, I do remember from the book, because I know a number of the people you talk about in the evacuation, that the message went to Jim DeHart,
Yes,
who had been Ambassador Hines' deputy, and he was the
correct.
one that passed it on to Aronson for action. Obviously, writing this story and writing the kinds of books you have in the past, which are so focused on individual experiences and really so fraught with emotional import, it's important to fact check and corroborate what you're putting on the page. And so as you pursue this book, because you spoke obviously at length with Sam and with Homeda, but were there methods or systems you used, speaking to others, broader reading, to be
Sure.
able to sort of corroborate and give a feel? And I say this because what I was also struck by was just the wonderful attention to detail you had, whether it was the layout at the airport. It felt very familiar to me from my 3 years plus in Afghanistan, but certainly your description of life in the city And I'm assuming a lot of that came from sources or speaking to people other than Homeda and to Sam.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the question and what it suggests, and that is the heart of my work in many ways. Is fact checking making you feel, or especially someone like you who knows a place, that this feels familiar? That I recognize this place, I recognize these people, I recognize the smell of the market, or just how people interact on the street in this particular culture. I did all those things that you described, where, you know, I'm an old Associated Press reporter, and I spent 3 years with the AP. And before we went to work every day, before your shift began, you did something called reading in. You would read everything that had gone out on the wire in the 24 hours or the last time you had been on shift. And so when I start a project like this, I read in, and I will devour, depending on, what time permits, everything I can get my hands on, even things that seem sort of, ancillary, sort of off or a tangent, to get the feel of a place and the feel of the people and the feel of a culture, both a culture like the State Department culture and the obvious culture of Kabul in 2021. And then I do, as much as possible, a tremendous amount of cross-checking. So, no one's going to challenge or doubt Omera's feelings, or Sam's impressions of his first day arriving on the ground at the airport. But there are a thousand other facts. I describe a book of 90,000 words, so call it 9,000 sentences. Those are 9,000 chances for me to get something wrong, and I treat it that way. And so I'm enormously grateful to the State Department, that I got permission to speak not only to Sam. That, all my interviews with Sam were sanctioned, were approved. They were not. There was no there was no intermediary. There was no minder. But those were all approved, as were mine with Mustafa Popal, with Jim DeHart, with other people on the ground, J.P. Feldmayer. And so I'm talking to all of those people. And then I'm talking to people who I just happen to know, who are natives of Kabul here in Boston. And I'm just going to take them out to lunch and talk to them about the city. And then when I'm talking to Omera, I'm going to ask her about, oh, well, tell me about that park. Somebody told me that that's a place where a lot of drug dealers or drug addicts congregate. And she, oh yes, absolutely. That where she went, where she saw refugees. And so I start piecing together and sort of knitting together what we, the telling details, because you can overwhelm a story with details that to me are not relevant. So I'm looking for telling relevant details, and fact checking everything. And so even where obviously I gained a tremendous trust for Sam and also for Omera, but even things, people have memory failures or memory gaps. I certainly do. And so, for instance, the events at the gate, at the CIA gate at the airport, I'm going to check everything that Sam tells me against everyone else I can talk to who was there. So he had enlisted a young Afghan man, a young translator, a really heroic young man named Assad Durrani. And so when I'm interviewing Assad, I'm not only getting everything from Assad's point of view, I'm also checking, well, do you remember when, what do you remember about what Sam said here? Like, so I'm not prompting him. I'm giving him an open question for him to fill, you know, and then when inevitably, so for instance, Omera and Sam have some different memories. They had different perspectives. She was coming toward him, he was coming toward her. So literally they're seeing things in mirror. And I just do the best I can to fairly reconcile the inevitable differences of two narratives, to make it seamless, but also in the notes of the book. And I'm always very focused on the notes in every book I write, at the end notes, to acknowledge that there are going to be certain things that one person's heard one thing and one heard another. I want to throw it back to you, but I have to give Sam a shout out. Sam was remarkable, both in terms of his memory and because he's much younger than I am, he was constantly writing himself voice notes on his phone, or giving himself voice notes on his phone, or sending texts, and which is priceless for someone like me. So Sam was able to download to me all these notes, so these are exactly what he was saying or thinking, and so I'm literally hearing the voice note with planes taking off and with AK fire in the background on this little voice note that was, coincident to when it was happening. That's just priceless. So to get it right.
It really is. Information collection for books, for testimonies,
Yes.
for television interviews.
Yes.
It's just astonishing the level of veracity we can now establish almost instantly because of electronic media. Your story's obviously focused on individuals rather than policies. But what I was taking away from it, chapter after chapter, were the challenges at different moments. I mean, we're talking about a period of not more than about 14 days and rather less from the moment the evacuation was launched. And it's conveying what individuals were going through, consular officers a few meters back trying to work with young Marines at the gates as every day, tens of thousands, and then it seemed like a lot more than tens of thousands of Afghans desperate to come in, and working from a list of prioritization, which is familiar in every evacuation or crisis situation we know around the world, just impossible. And trying to pinpoint people, assist families as they're doing it. Some people going outside the gate to help people in before that terrorist attack on Abbey Gate on the 26th. But even on the 26th, there were people at Abbey Gate working to get things done. And you reflect very well the pain and the hard decisions that officers had to make. Obviously, work through with what you write about, Sam, but you have the vignettes about others having to decide who they're going to help, how they're going to help, how they determine whose families, how they interpret the guidelines going through. And those guidelines were shifting, which made the work all the more difficult as the crowds grew in size, as the physical dangers grew, and especially after the terrorist attack on August 26th. And I'll note that many people went immediately back to work a couple of hours after that attack to continue processing. But what is it you've learned about in writing this story, and before that 13 hours, about the making decisions on the fly, the individuals you highlight in The Secret Gate, the Sam's decision-making process, what you did in 13 hours? What is it that motivated individuals in your mind as you write about them and look at the process through years and crises situations? You talk in your book about 9/11, about extraordinary moments of heroics. How do you, what's your sort of analysis of what motivates people? How do they make these decisions? What carries them through from one day to the next as they're making these decisions? Because they're not doing it for a second. They make the decision, they take the plunge, and they move forward.
Boy, that is so central to the people I've been privileged to write about, Mike, in numerous books. And I guess my takeaway, let me start it back a little bit. So I come up from a reporting background, and where skepticism is obviously a watchword for us. It's a guiding light. But I've never become cynical, and that's because I've had the privilege to get to know people who, again and again, in these situations, during 9/11, during in Benghazi, and certainly on the ground here, where people were trying their best. These were people of good character. These were people who you would want in a foxhole with you, who were determined to do to follow their conscience as far as they could, or they wouldn't. I mean, let's face it, very few people, I'm going to guess, join the State Department, just like journalism, to get rich. there's a mission. These are mission-driven people, and those I've always been drawn to people who are determined to do something that's right or do what's right wherever they can. And those people also often, and I've found, and I think I've portrayed this in The Secret Gate, they often find themselves frustrated because larger systems, because bureaucracies, because forces beyond anyone's control or knowledge, the people, I believe the people who are in Washington who are dictating these shifting rules, they weren't trying to be difficult for the people on the ground. They were trying to do the best they could to fill the planes as quickly and efficiently with the priority list that they had. And so, how do we reconcile that on the ground? I start from a place of believing that these are people of goodwill and good faith, and trying to do what's right. And by starting that way, when I come across actions or behavior that deviates from that, it helps me recognize that, and it helps me sort of approach that and ask, well, what could have been his or her motive, and give them the benefit of the doubt, and wait until, and as a young reporter, I'm not sure I would have had this much patience or maturity. I would have been maybe a little quicker to call something out as as a finger point. But my expectation now is that people who are doing this work are doing it, and certainly people who are on the ground in Kabul, I think without exception from what I know and what I've heard, had this mission-centric approach. And if they deviated from it, there may be a good reason, and I need to respect that and honor that and reflect that in my work.
That's, I think, a very sharp observation
Yeah,
on what drives people in these unusual circumstances. And I can certainly speak from personal experience, but I think many of the people who are listening to us today can also reflect back on moments where they've worked in moments of war or government or societal breakdown, whether they're working in refugee camps or embassies under siege, thinking about our people. This may be ancient history for some, but our embassy in Monrovia that were completely surrounded and isolated in the middle of a breakdown of a civil war in that country. And you're absolutely right. I think it is a question of people reflecting how they can interpret and manage a situation which really doesn't have very well-defined rules, whatever the paperwork coming over trying to provide the guidelines indicates. There's another aspect to this in your book, which you did it sort of in passing, but you did it in passing right the way through. And that was the universe of the outside world that was looking for help from the embassy, from our people on the ground in the base, from any contacts they had, whether it was in the military, whether it was in the State Department, whether it was with the intelligence agencies, whether it was from mayors in France, to people trying to help clerics, to our own mission personnel. I remember one story about somebody in Nigeria getting in touch with Sam to help a UN person leave the country. And it's was really quite striking to me just how broad this was. And I think it's difficult for people who aren't involved in this to realize just how many thousands of messages pour in a day when these crises hit, let alone something like what we saw in Afghanistan after 20 years of engagement. And there's literally, I think it's almost 1 million Americans served in Afghanistan in either civilian, contract, or military service there. And what we see is all of these people trying to help get people out, even parallel to what was happening in the evacuation. You do throw these things in there, and you certainly, from another interview I heard you on, you're aware of this wider universe. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you saw that, how it helped you prepare for the book, and how you saw the ties, which were emotional as well as professional and humanitarian, between Americans and Afghans at this critical moment?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mike. I love that. So I did something similar. I think what made me aware of it and the need to reflect it in the book was something I did in frankly in 13 hours. And it was a bit different because they felt obviously the men and women in Benghazi felt quite isolated at the time. But there were things happening, and none of these things happen in isolation. And so there are moments in that book where I bring in what's happening when the Secretary of State or when the president holds a news conference and sort of I'm maintaining a ticking clock in real time, what's happening, and then maybe breaking the narrative and shifting the point of view to Washington to get a sense that this is not happening completely in a vacuum. And I knew it was even greater here for the reasons that you describe, that so many people had feelings or ties or personal connections to people who were now suddenly fearing death at the hands of the Taliban. And so, of course, they were flooding this tiny skeleton. I mean, I remember when Sam first told me how many people were there from the State Department, I was like, no, that's not possible. You're missing a zero. How could it be 40 or, whatever? Like, no, how could they possibly? So I wanted to reflect this small dedicated unit of people working back-to-back 12-hour shifts getting, the whole world is focused on them. Everything from literally the Vatican to the White House to some guy in Kansas who is trying to reach someone who can get his translator out. And the end point of all of those were Jim DeHart or Mustafa or Sam or JP and I think what really awakened me to it was something that JP Feldmayer said to me, who was on the ground there, who was a coordinator of the between the intelligence agencies and the State Department. And he said he hated going to sleep because he feared he would miss messages from people. Like that's, he was getting so many, his inbox was so overflowing, and he had such anxiety of closing his eyes that he might miss one of these. I realized I have to reflect that in the book and start with the people like Sam and JP and Mustafa and Jim and Ambassador Bass, and then flow outward to all the people who are, who are making these, really dropping notes into bottles and throwing them in the ocean, hoping somebody picks theirs out and calls their Omira.
It's a great metaphor because certainly the challenge, and I think again, many of us today can probably attest to being part of that message bombardment of our colleagues on the ground, and forever grateful if they were able to answer a few of them because the pressures were so terrible.
If I may, one of my favorite lines in the book, this is self congratulatory, but is like, I realized Sam's parents didn't know he was there, but it seemed like everyone else did.
Yeah.
Yeah, like everyone who he had ever worked with, who he had ever known from college on, or maybe even from junior high school, seemed to know that he was in Kabul, but his parents were completely in the dark, and as a result, every one of them were sort of seeing him as their endpoint, their savior. So that was, when that occurred to me, I just that was a pleasurable moment.
Yeah, I actually I won't say enjoyed, but certainly, uh, the points on family relations when officers or diplomatic personnel and our military colleagues are in moments of danger and crisis, take on an entirely different level of intensity. Um, if I can, perhaps switch a little to some of what actually happened in the book, and to me, one of the more surprising elements was when Humaira and Sam actually make contact with each other, and the relative lack of confidence and trust. And I've heard you sort of say elsewhere that trust really is the foundation in moments of crisis? How do people decide to work
Right.
with complete strangers when their lives are at stake or their loved ones' lives are at stake? And so perhaps you could speak to how you saw that relationship develop over a period of a couple of days, and
Yeah.
and uh, and how it ended.
Sure. So, as Omera is a brilliant woman, and she also, like a lot of Afghans, I think, I hesitate to speak too broadly, but she had complicated feelings about the American withdrawal, and she had complicated feelings about um, you know, the Doha Agreement and what flowed out of that, and then she had this terrible experience at Abbey Gate where she reached this conclusion that the Americans don't have a plan; they only have a deadline. And because she was battered, and her brother was beaten, and Siavash was pushed around, and then she was rejected at Abbey Gate. So she didn't feel trust in that moment, but she knew it was her only option. It had finally been impressed upon her if she didn't leave, her life was forfeit. And at the same time, for Sam, he's dealing with the fact that he just experienced sort of at a very small remove the explosion at Abbey Gate. So that's August 26th, and he was there in the Jock that night, and he had just been out at Abbey Gate. He knew what it was like, and he had just been out on the line when 13 flag draped coffins were put on a cargo plane. And so, he's still hearing about suicide bombers, that there are more plans, that there are more sort of, and you would expect all this. So neither has any sort of reason to trust the other in a way, and yet they do in such an extraordinary moment, because the humanity of the other, and the sort of the snap decisions we all make in this moment. If I don't do this, it could be worse for this other person or worse for me. And so when Omera shows up at the gate, not only with her son, which was what was agreed upon, but her young military aged brother, Jaber, Sam is, Sam's resistant, and she also shows up with her laptop. And we know large electronics can be used for other purposes, and sort of, retrofitted as explosives. And so he's making a series of snap judgments that I admire him for, and also think speak to something innate within us about wanting to trust people to be good. And in that case, that is one of the most extraordinary moments I've ever been privileged to write about, when they finally come together in Tajikhan Road, and there's still doubt. And then he sees her laptop, and his RSO, his security is like, get rid of it, dude. There's like that's a bomb possibly. And but he sees in her this humanity, and he gets it, that her life is in there. She's a writer. She's had to leave everything behind. If I can just help her that way. And there's a moment in the book, right, around that same time, where at the same time Sam and Mustafa brought in another family who Mustafa Popal had been trying to help for days. And Sam goes to this area just inside this sort of the gate area. It's not really a gate, this entrance area.
Right.
And he sees all of their belongings have been dumped out. And he realizes just how much they had to give up. These women, she had a bag full of makeup, and she had to leave that behind. Like, of all the things that you would bring, she just wanted to preserve her sense of self and her sense of. And when he saw that, I think he knew that getting her laptop, getting her what she needed, would be a way to restore her humanity, and give her a leg up as she became part of the American refugee system.
The small details are really so extraordinary, and I certainly spent several years of my life working on refugee assistance, and it's truly amazing how these little small aspects of personal life become so important to an individual, and then you have to make a decision on what to do about it. And I would note, I think in your book, towards the end, you also note that Sam, among others, received heroism awards, and partly a reflection of the dictum I heard many times in the Foreign Service, because we worked in a bureaucracy: act first and ask for forgiveness later, if you think something has to be moved. And people working in bureaucracy certainly know the challenge of doing that. I'm supposed to cede to questions there may be amongst our audience, but if I can just close with saying, I have my doctorate in history, and so I very much appreciate what your father imbued in you. And the second, because I heard it in another interview, you've got perhaps a movie in the works. There will be more to this story in the coming months. But at this point, I would ask my colleague at AFSA, Asgir, if we have questions for Mitch from the audience. Certainly encourage in the time that's left for people to step forward.
Let's start with this question right here, which is, who do you see as the primary audience for this book?
Great question. Well, first, Mike, thank you for such a wonderful conversation. I'm very grateful for that. I think, as much as I love being here, I'm writing for a general audience. I'm writing for an audience who don't know as much as the folks on this call do. I would love to see, and I'm not talking about for sales reasons. I love the idea of exposing people who don't appreciate or don't have any idea of the risks, the sacrifice, the courage of the men and women of the Foreign Service, and so I'm hoping there's a 14-year-old. And we got this a lot with 13 Hours. I hope there's a 14-year-old boy or girl out there who reads this and says, "Oh, I had no idea what diplomats do. I thought they just sort of sit in rooms in Brooks Brothers suits." Like the human on the ground interaction of someone like Chris Stevens in Libya, or someone like Sam Aronson, or Ambassador Bass, or Jim. And so I really hope it reaches people who don't have an appreciation of what the folks on this call do.
Thank you very much. We also have a comment here, which is, it says, "Thank you for giving the Foreign Service credit for evacuating thousands. Elliot Ackerman in the Fifth Act repeatedly implied that the U.S. government did nothing to evacuate Afghans."
Yeah, I can't speak to Elliot's book. I appreciate Elliot reviewed this book. I don't know. I've had a brief interaction with him on email. It seemed to me that this book would be incomplete, and if you look at the book, you'll see I almost use the numbers, the numbers from the White House on a daily basis as a ticking clock. As of this day we had 50,000 people out, and as of this day we had 80, or what have you, because that was an important context to see. What Sam was doing, certainly, and what the individuals I was focused on was a retail effort, but there was this wholesale effort happening all around them of thousands of people. And I saw in the White House's after action report a couple of weeks ago, I don't want to misquote it, the number of flights out, and the fact that there wasn't a single flight missed, and that was all happening. And so again, I don't want to speak to anybody else's book, but I would not have portrayed it nearly accurately had I not shown that this was part of an enormous effort. And I do remember this. I don't want to say the reporter, because I respect the reporter very much, but there was a reporter, a television reporter, at the very beginning of this on August 15th, said, "There's no way they're going," I couldn't believe it was a prediction. "There's no way they're going to be able to get out as many people as they say they will in the time allotted." And I said, "Really? There's no way?" And this person was so certain that that the State Department, that the U.S. government had set itself an impossible task. And so when 124,000 people are evacuated in most of them in that period from August 15th to August 27th, man, you got to give credit for that.
Thank you. I'm sure the audience agrees with you. The next question is sort of almost a logical follow-up to this, which is, can you talk about your experience with and view of the Foreign Service now that you've written 2 in-depth books that feature America's diplomats?
Absolutely. I'm proud to do that. It's a weird place to start, but so I wrote an earlier book about the Coast Guard, and I didn't know much about the Coast Guard when I wrote a book called Frozen in Time. And the deeper I got and the more coasties I met, the more I was like, why don't I know about these? Like, you know, the integrity of these people, and I had the almost exact same experience. You know, with just one after another. The people I met were people I how do I put it? I recognized of sort of the kind of people I've tried my whole life to surround myself with. People who are, you know, just the intelligence, the sincerity, the courage, the willingness to put mission first. So I have a you know, look, it's like all big systems. I'm telling you people, there are flaws. You know, there are things I've heard and things I've written about. Of course, it's imperfect. It's a human-run system, but the humans I've met within it have, to a person, impressed me.
For that, next question is, how does interviewing and writing differ when the event took place recently with details and traumas fresh? Why something that happened years or decades ago when ideas, memories, or values of the interviewees may have changed?
That's a great question. And first, I want to speak to the issue of trauma. And this is something that I dealt with a lot, certainly when I wrote my book about 9/11. So I was the lead reporter for the Boston Globe on 9/11. I wrote the lead stories on that day. So that's been with me. So 15 or so years later, when I wrote the book, I recognized exactly what this questioner is talking about. Things had changed, even, you know, in that relatively short span. We're not even talking about World War II. The first thing I do is make sure that I'm not creating secondary trauma or repeating trauma for people who are trauma victims. That's the first rule of compassionate reporting and empathetic reporting. And so whatever I think I need to write this book or to interview these people, it doesn't hold a candle to what they need to do to heal and to deal with what they are processing. And so that's my first thing I do. I recognize that I am writing in this moment kind of it's not the first draft of history that we write in newspapers, but it's the second draft of history. And someone may come back and with access to perspective and documents and data. I would never be so conceited as to think this is the last word on the Afghanistan withdrawal. And I look forward to those books. But I'm hoping to contribute by capturing these thoughts when they're fresh, because there's something really powerful about little details. I can, you know, Omera remembers what tea she served, you know, and she remembers what food she prepared for Siavash on the day they went out onto their balcony and opposed and, you know, and screamed Allahu Akbar, you know, in repudiation of the Taliban. So those kinds of details are really valuable to put you there, but we might write a different book or a different cast in the version of this story that's told in 2040, and I hope it is told.
Thank you very much. Next question is, what do you think are the most important lessons learned from the Afghanistan evacuations, and what do you want the reader to take away from your book?
Well, this goes back to a little bit of my disclaimer at the beginning that I'm somewhat hesitant to give a prescription to the State Department. I did appreciate I did agree, frankly, in terms of lessons learned. And the White House expressed this of the need for earlier action. And certainly in Sudan, or in I think the better example is probably Ukraine. The need, I recognize we're weighing really hard factors against one another. So, for instance, the hesitation of suggesting that get out because this government's about to fail, obviously hastening the outcome we don't want. But that acknowledgement, and I think this comes through, I think, in the book, and I think also in this after action report that I agree with completely, that we need to prioritize individual safety of Americans and American allies over political considerations in that moment, because we waited too long here. I hope, in terms of what people come away with, Mike mentioned earlier, I wrote a book about the director, Robert Altman, and Bob, who I knew near the end of his life, always refused to tell people what to think of his movies or what was his message. I think the message comes through about the individuals here. I think different people should sort of find in this book a message for their own humanity and their own behavior, whether they're in the State Department or they're working in Starbucks.
Great. All right, we seem to have about 3 more questions remaining, so let's get to those. Did you get any pushback from state or other parts of the government as you dug into this topic, which is still controversial and political?
I did not. There was one thing I'll talk about briefly. So I got wonderful cooperation from Ned Price and that office, and making people available to me. And again, I want to emphasize, Sam spoke to me with the approval of the spokesman's office, and so did all the other people who spoke to me from state. There was a moment when the manuscript was finished when state asked for an advance copy, and that's something we don't normally do, and so we had a bit of a back and forth there. But it ended respectfully, and I appreciate how state behaved throughout this process.
All right, thank you. Next is actually a process question, which is not unusual for an audience that is probably filled with future authors. And that is, how long was the process from conception of the book till publication?
Sure. So I always answer it. I don't mean to be flippant. I've been doing this for 40 years, so it was a 40-year process to figure out how to do this book. But basically, from fall of 2021, I think I finished the manuscript in fall, probably 1 year to write the full draft. 11 or 12 months to write a complete, polished draft of this book, and that was fast. Because obviously we wanted to get it out, and I thought I could get it out while the story was still fresh, and while it was still being talked about, and while the House investigations, or it's still relevant, it's still there. So it was about a year, and then then there's just the publishing process, which I'm still a newspaper guy at heart, where when I hit send on my computer, I expect to see it the next day, on the front page. So then there was another 6 or whatever months till last week when it was published.
Thank
And
you.
I guess want to add, and I want to be clear, I'm not a healthy person in terms of work-life balance when I'm on a book. That's a very intense 12-month period where my wife will attest, I don't take much time off. There's a very rare, once every few months, there'll be a day off, a full day off in that period. So it's a pretty intense 12-month stretch.
Thank you. Here's a question related to the possible film version of this alluded to earlier. Are you concerned that the narrative would be further sensationalized during the making of a film?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why I insist, and I was fortunate. I am proud, and people may disagree. I am proud of what happened with 13 Hours. I think that movie, look, of course it's dramatized. So, um, I don't expect it to be the book. The book, my joke is that the book is called 13 Hours. The movie is 2 hours. There are going to be changes. And it's the same thing's going to happen here. When this is adapted, it will be where I will involve myself, and what I insist upon, and in the talks we're having right now, I will be an executive producer on the movie. I will be a consultant to the screenwriter. I will have to trust the production team and the director before I grant the rights. And you still, when you sell something, you don't own it anymore, and so I'll still have to give up some control there. But I do have this sort of the moral power of saying, if you sensationalize it, again, I don't mind dramatization. When I'm talking, my issues are with fictionalization and with sensationalizing. If you cross those two lines, then I'm going to repudiate it publicly. And that's really bad for a movie. It's just, if the author of it says, I'm washing my hands of it, I'm not going on the movie tour, they don't want that. And so that's the leverage I'll use, because it's too important not to. And because also, just on a personal level, I really care about these people I wrote about. And so I'm going to insist that they be treated fairly.
Thank you for that answer. We have time for about one more question, so let's pick one that's sort of forward-looking. What's next for you as an author? Should we expect more writing on topics that have a close connection to those in this audience?
Did my agent put you up to that question? I don't know who asked that. He keeps asking me what's next. I would love to. I've really enjoyed those two books, but I do not. I don't have a project. My next for me is actually I'm going. We talked about this other project that I did a while ago, a book I did a while ago about Greenland and the Coast Guard. So I'm going back to Greenland this summer on an expedition. We're trying to find a lost World War II seaplane, a Grumman duck with 3 incredible heroes. The only 2 missing in action, believed to be recoverable members of the Coast Guard from World War II, who are buried in ice with this plane and with a young man they tried to save. We went looking for it in 2012 and 2013. A decade later, we have a bead on it, we think. So that'll be next for me, which I don't know if it'll be a book or a magazine piece.
Thank you. That sounds very intriguing. At this
Thank
point,
you.
let me hand it back to Ambassador McKinley to wrap up this conversation.
Oh, they're giving me about 60 seconds. Maybe I've got 90. I'm not sure. But Mitch, I want to thank you again for taking so much time with us and being so forthcoming. And certainly there was a hint of a couple of political elements in the questions, which is only natural given what happened. But I think what's important about your book is that focus that you mentioned just a short time ago on the humanity of the situation and how individuals react. And I think the book, real tribute to really illuminating on how people act under crisis, but also tribute to what the Foreign Service does in extreme circumstances. So thank you again for being with us this week, and wishing you the best.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank to everyone here and to the Foreign Service Association. It's been a delight.